Okay, section 4 here of day 8. So in previous section, we talked about the 2008 financial crisis itself. Now I want to talk about the aftermath leading into a discussion of the pandemic today. Um, what happened, right? How did the government respond and adjust regulation in an attempt to make sure that another banking crisis like what happened in 2008 would never happen again? So what we got was the 2008, the 2010 Frank-Dodd Financial Reform Act. It was the most comprehensive reform of the U.S. financial system since the Great Depression. It was a doozy, right? Hotly contested by bank lobbyists who continue to water it down as it gets implemented. And there's still parts of this that are being implemented today. And so let me briefly talk about some of the changes that Frank Dodd implemented on the U.S. financial system. And I'm kind of organized these changes associated with the problem that they were trying to solve. First off, there is the problem that the perception that many banks were too big to fail, and that this led to moral hazard. And so there were two big changes that Frank Dodd has implemented. First off, what we call resolution authority. In the future, if banks fail, they will not get bailed out in the same way that they were in 2008. If a bank fails, they'll go into Chapter 13 of organized bankruptcy, and they will be liquidated, right? Banks have to make a living will. In other words, all banks basically already have a liquidation plan in place in case they run into trouble, right? So the government might provide them some liquidity in the future, but that's only going to be temporary. And to take a bailout basically means the bank agrees to go bankrupt in the future. So organized bankruptcy is the way that most firms go bankrupt, not banks, but firms, right? And it doesn't mean you go bankrupt tomorrow, but what it means is that you gradually wind down your activities. And that's what banks would be forced to do if they become insolvent in the future, right? They're not just going to get a no string attached bailout and then be able to go on like nothing ever happened. Also, the Federal Reserve now is the systematic regulator of the financial system. Before 2008, we've talked about that there was kind of this very overlapping and varied system for regulation in which many regulators could regulate every single bank. And it led to just really a lot of holes, right? A lot of holes in the system. And so now the Fed is the systematic regulator of the financial system and has a lot more authority to identify systematically important institutions. The Fed regularly conducts stress tests now of banks and reports the results so that the public can be more informed about how vulnerable banks are to any potential failure. And so, the hope is that this systematic regulation will mean that banks are much more aware of their weaknesses and attending to those weaknesses before a crisis occurs. A second problem is that banks just took too much risk, right? They were taking too many risks. And so how do we prevent that? Through a number of changes. First off, the Consumer Protection Bureau, right, which aimed at protecting consumers from predatory lending practices, aimed at regulating consumers and mortgage loans, is basically a part of the Fed, but it's independent of the Fed. And this is essentially regulating bank behavior, right? Making sure that banks aren't that the public has better information and banks aren't doing things that essentially are creating future defaults in the future. Also, Dodd-Frank tried to minimize moral hazard by making sure that the Federal Reserve couldn't be such an aggressive lender of last resort. Banks can't lend to individual banks anymore to facilitate mergers. That's one of the things the Fed did, was they helped facilitate mergers of banks that were in trouble with banks that weren't. The Fed can't do that anymore, right? They can only do broad-based lending programs that are available to everybody. And so once again, the idea here is that if banks don't think they're going to get this lender of last resort money, now maybe they'll be more careful. Securitization rules. Now, if a bank issues a mortgage, it has to keep 5% of any of that mortgage, right? To make sure that every bank who issues a mortgage has some skin in the game, that they actually pay attention to who they're lending to. Because of the perception that many banks just issued mortgages and turned right around and sold them all. And so they didn't really care, right? They really didn't care who they were lending to. The Volcker rule, right, which is one of the more contested parts of this. Basically, this prohibits banks from speculating for themselves, right? By speculating means that banks can't be engaged in market trading on behalf of themselves. They can only be engaged on behalf of their customers. Banks hate this, right? In part because banks say, rightly, it's very difficult to tell the difference sometimes between what I'm doing and what a bank is doing. Or I'm sorry, what I'm doing for my customers and what I'm doing for the bank. And so this has really been very hotly contested, and I'm dying to see some research on how this is actually working out, because I think there's a real question about whether the regulators can separate banks speculating for themselves versus banks speculating for their customers. One of the biggest changes is that banks have been required to hold a lot more capital than they did before, right? And this has reduced leverage and reduced return on equity and made banks less profitable, right? Banks hate this, right? Bank stock prices have been down in the dumps since 2008. And part of that is that banks are just a lot less profitable than they were, right? A lot less profitable. The capital requirements are larger for these strategically important financial institutions, right? The big banks. And so, as we're going to see in a second, banks have a lot more capital now than they did in 2008. Derivatives, financial derivatives are a lot more tightly regulated than they used to be, right? There's a lot, more and more banks can only issue derivatives through an exchange, meaning that they have to be transparent and publicly available. And they have to hold more reserves to back these financial derivatives, right? So in other words, they can't create these with as much leverage as they did before. Also, the rating agencies, right? Standard & Poor's are much more tightly regulated now by the SEC to make sure that they're giving better information about what the true risk associated with some of these bonds are, right? Having said this, many critics have complained that that Frank Dodd is too costly. It's too much regulation. Many liberals still complain that it hasn't gotten rid of the too big to fail banks. And many bank lobbyists complain because it's reduced bank prices. And so bank lobbyists have tried desperately to limit the impact of these rules in many, many different ways to in many ways, a very effective extent. So how has this set us up for the pandemic crisis? Let me take a break. I see my computer is almost out of juice. I forgot to plug it in. So we're going to break this session here, and we'll come back for one other short session, kind of talking a little bit about how banks are set up to survive the pandemic.